She survived a massacre in the desert. Then a stranger told her she had been sold, not kidnapped, not threatened, sold by her own father to pay a debt she never knew existed. She had two choices: run and owe $40,000 to men who would never stop hunting her, or marry a man she had known for 11 minutes and survive the next 6 months in a town that did not want her. She chose survival. What she did not choose was falling in love with the man who gave her a way out, and then gave her the freedom to walk away from it. This is Cole Ryder's story, and it will change the way you think about what a promise is worth. Here on this channel, we believe the frontier is not just a place, it is a feeling. Stories of the American West, of love earned the hard way, of mothers who hold everything together, and of ordinary people who find extraordinary courage in each other. If that is the kind of story that stays with you, you are exactly where you belong. The lesson this story carries: real freedom is not the absence of obligation, it is choosing, every single day, the life and the people worth staying for. If this story moved something in you, leave a comment below and tell us what it was. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe and hit the bell. We will be here every week with something worth your time.
I have made exactly 3 decisions in my life that I knew were wrong the moment I made them and did anyway. The first was staying in Dusty Creek the winter Eleanor got sick. The second was letting Douglas Crane operate in my town for 2 years without enough proof to stop him. The third was offering my name to a woman I had known for 11 minutes. Of the 3, only one turned out to be right. I will let you figure out which. It was a Tuesday in late June when everything changed. I was riding the northern ridge alone, the way I did most mornings, the way I had done for 3 years since Eleanor died, and the habit of solitude became the shape of my days. The Arizona sun was already brutal at 8 in the morning, and the red dust of the territory coated everything it touched, which was everything. I smelled the smoke before I saw it. There is a difference between cook-fire smoke and disaster smoke. Cook-fire smoke is slow and domestic and smells of wood and breakfast. Disaster smoke is faster, darker, and carries something underneath it that the body recognizes before the mind does. I had smelled both enough times to know which one this was before I crested the ridge and saw the canyon below. A stagecoach on its side. 4 armed men moving through the wreckage like they had all the time in the world. Because they did. The horses were screaming. 3 passengers were already on the ground and not moving. The man I recognized as the lead rider of the Hollow Creek gang was going through a woman's trunk with the casual interest of a man shopping at a market. I did not wait for backup. I had been doing this alone for 3 years. I took the first 2 men from the ridge with the rifle, rode hard into the canyon, and drove the remaining 2 off with a 3rd shot that grazed the lead rider's ear close enough that he did not stop riding for a long time. Then I went through the wreckage. 3 dead, 1 man unconscious with a broken leg breathing, and then at the far end of the overturned coach, with her back pressed against the wood and both hands wrapped around the handle of a snapped umbrella, pointed at me like it was a bayonet. A woman I'd never seen before. Her dress was ruined. Her hair had come completely down. There was a cut above her right eyebrow bleeding into her lashes. She did not look like a woman in shock. She looked like a woman who had decided that whatever came next, she was going to make it cost something. I raised both hands. Cole Ryder, Sheriff of Dusty Creek. That is exactly what the last man said, she told me. The last man had a wanted poster in 3 territories. I have a badge. Badges can be stolen. I almost smiled. I did not smile. True. But stolen badges do not usually come with a deputy named Frank who is going to arrive in about 4 minutes and be extremely disappointed if I have been hit with an umbrella. A pause. She lowered the umbrella. Not because she trusted me. Because she had assessed the situation and determined this was her best option. I would remember this distinction later. Her name was Vivian Ashford. She was 23 years old and she had come from Boston on a stagecoach headed for a cousin's spare room and a promise of employment, That, she told me later on the ride back, she had already received word was no longer available. The letter had caught up with her on the road. She had read it and put it in her bag and continued riding because there was nowhere else to go. I put her and the injured man on horses and rode back to Dusty Creek with the kind of silence that comes after violence, when the body is still running on what it needed to survive and the mind has not yet caught up. She sat straight in the saddle on a borrowed horse she had never met. She did not cry. She did not chatter nervously. She watched the landscape like she was memorizing it. My wife, Eleanor, would have cried after something like that. Not from weakness. Eleanor was not weak. But she felt things immediately and let them move through her. This woman was doing something different. She was storing it, filing it somewhere internal. I recognized the habit because it was mine. Eleanor had been dead for 3 years. She died of fever 4 days after it started, while I was 2 counties over tracking a killer and telling myself I would be back before anything went wrong. I was back in time to hold her hand, not in time to save her. Her brother Thomas had offered comfort from his farm in Kansas, and I had declined. I had been declining everything offered since. I brought Vivian to Pearl McGee's place, the seamstress at the center of town, who was the only woman I trusted to handle a situation like this without turning it into ammunition. Pearl opened the door, read the situation in 2 seconds, and took Vivian inside without a word. "She needs a room tonight," I said, "maybe longer." "Go do your job, Sheriff," Pearl said, and closed the door. I went to the office and wrote my report. I was halfway through it when Douglas Crane walked in without knocking. Crane was 60 years old, silver-haired, and dressed better than anyone in Dusty Creek had a right to be. He spoke quietly because he had never needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted. He set a document on my desk, sat down, crossed his legs, and waited. I read it. I read it again. A marriage contract. Harlan Ashford of Boston, signed 8 months ago, pledging his daughter Vivian to Douglas Crane in settlement of a debt of $40,000. Legal under territorial frontier law. Witnessed and notarized. "The young woman you brought in today," Crane said. "I would like her delivered to my house by morning." I set the document down. "Delivered," I said. "You understand my meaning." "I understand your meaning. I am deciding whether to arrest you for it." Crane smiled the smile of a man who had never been arrested and did not expect to start now. "The contract is legal, Sheriff. I am simply asking you to do your job." "My job is keeping the peace. Come back with a court order." After he left, I read the contract 3 more times. On the 4th reading, I found what I had missed. A specific clause buried in the legal language. If Vivian was already legally married to another party before Crane exercised his claim, the contract was void. I stared at that clause for a long time. Then I put on my hat and walked back to Pearl's in the dark, not entirely sure what I was going to say when I got there, knowing only that whatever it was would change things. The stars over Arizona were obscene in their brightness. Too many, too clear. A sky that has no interest in human problems. Pearl's front room, early the next morning, before the town woke up. Vivian was already dressed when I arrived, the same ruined dress from the day before, mended overnight with Pearl's thread. The repairs were imperfect but precise. She was not a woman who accepted disorder she could fix. I put the contract on the table between us. I watched her read it. Her expression did not change, her hands did not move. When she finished, she set it down flat and aligned it with the edge of the table. A precise, controlled gesture that I understood cost her something. "My father signed this," she said, 8 months ago. "Yes. He has been dead for 4 months. The contract transfers. To Crane." "Yes." Silence. Then she looked at me. "What do you want, Sheriff?" I laid it out plainly. The void clause, the marriage option. 6 months, a room of her own, no obligations beyond maintaining appearances. After 6 months, travel money and a legal release to go anywhere she chose. She listened without interrupting, which I noted as one of the rarest things I had encountered in a human being. Then she asked, "Why?" I told her the public reason. Crane had too much power in this town. This stopped him. She watched me with eyes that were measuring the distance between what I was saying and what I meant. So I told her the real reason. Margaret Pruitt, I said, 2 years ago. A widow with 2 children, a man with money and a contract, and no one willing to stop him. I had the law on my side, and I lost anyway. I have not stopped thinking about where she is, whether her children are all right. I looked at the table. I am not doing this again, I said. Vivian studied me. You are not offering to save me. You are trying to save yourself from another failure. Both things can be true, I said. That answer, its honesty, its refusal to dress itself up, landed differently than anything charming would have. I could see it land. She negotiated. Of course she negotiated. She wanted everything in writing, witnessed, legally binding. She wanted to work, not sit idle for 6 months. She wanted access to the town's legal documents, every ordinance and contract on record. If I am going to live here, she said, I need to understand how it operates. And then the condition that stopped me cold. If I choose to leave at the end of 6 months, she said, you do not slow me down. And if I choose to stay, that is also my choice. Not yours, not the contracts, mine. Agreed, I said. I agreed before I had finished thinking it through. I had not done that since Eleanor was alive. We married the next morning in the town clerk's office. 8 minutes. Frank Holt and Pearl McGee as witnesses. No flowers, no music. Vivian wore the mended dress. I wore my work clothes because it did not occur to me to change, and she did not ask me to. I produced a ring from my vest pocket. My mother's, plain silver, slightly too large. I had not examined why I brought it. As I slid it onto her finger, I looked up and found her already looking at me, not with warmth, not with hostility. With the careful assessment she gave everything. Outside, Douglas Crane was standing across the street. He watched us emerge from the clerk's office. He did not move, did not speak. His expression was the expression of a man revising his plans, not abandoning them. I kept my hand at the small of Vivian's back. Not from affection, from instinct. Crane saw it. I told myself it was tactical. Crane needed to believe this was real. I was lying to myself, but I would not understand that for some time. That evening, Frank pulled me aside while Vivian spoke with Pearl on the street. Cole, Frank said, in the voice he used when he had found something he wished he had not found. I have been asking around about that contract. The debt Harlan Ashford supposedly owed Crane. I cannot find a record of the original transaction anywhere. It appears in Crane's books fully formed 18 months ago with no origin point. Keep looking, I said. There is something else. The Hollow Creek gang was seen near Crane's ranch 3 weeks before the attack. I looked across the street. Vivian was standing in the afternoon light talking to Pearl, wearing her too large ring and her mended dress, and her expression of careful observation. Keep looking, I said again, and Frank. Do not tell her yet. My house was clean in the way of a man who has no one to be messy for, no color anywhere, no decoration. Eleanor's things had been packed away the week after she died and had not come back out. The walls were bare. The shelves held only what was functional. 3 years of deliberate emptiness. Vivian moved through it like an archaeologist, touching nothing, observing everything. Her room was small and functional, with a lock on the door as I had promised. I heard her try the lock twice before she began unpacking. I was in the main room, and I said nothing. That first week established the rhythms that would govern the months to come. She burned the biscuits on the second morning. Not catastrophically, just thoroughly. The smoke filled the kitchen, and she was standing over the wreckage with an expression of concentrated fury, directed entirely at the biscuits when I came home. I picked one up, looked at it, set it down. Stew is fine, I said. I am not apologizing for biscuits, she told me. I did not ask you to. I ate 2 bowls of stew, did not mention the biscuits again. Eleanor had made perfect biscuits. I used to take them for granted. Standing in that smoky kitchen, I thought about what it means to take something for granted, and what it means when you no longer can. Vivian presented herself at Pearl's shop the next morning before I was awake. Pearl put her to work on the account books, which Vivian completed with an efficiency that made Pearl put down her needle and stare. Word spread through Dusty Creek the way all words spread through small towns, which is to say, immediately and with embellishment. The sheriff's wife worked at Pearl's. Opinions divided sharply. Some people approved. Some people thought it reflected poorly on me. Ruth Calloway, the postmistress who served as the town's unofficial moral compass, came to see for herself. Ruth studied Vivian for a long moment. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" Vivian asked. "Decoration." "I have been decoration before," Vivian said. "I found it tedious." Ruth nodded once and left. Pearl told me later, that was the closest Ruth came to a compliment. On the fourth day, Serena Voss arrived at the house with a pie. Serena was 40 years old and beautiful in the maintained way of a woman who considered it a discipline. She had been bringing things to my house since Eleanor died. Pies, casseroles, company I had not asked for and had not known how to refuse without cruelty. Vivian opened the door. The two women looked at each other. "You must be the new Mrs. Ryder," Serena said. "I am Serena Voss. Cole and I are old friends." The weight she put on old friends was precisely calibrated. Enough to mean something. Not enough to be accused of saying it. "How kind," Vivian said. "I will tell him you called." She closed the door, set the pie on the table, did not touch it. That evening she said, "Serena Voss came by. I figured she would," I said. "Not looking up from my paperwork. She loves you. That is her business. It becomes my business when she is deciding how much of a problem I am." I looked up. A long pause. "Fair point," I said. That same week, Pearl called me into the back of her shop alone. "You know I knew Eleanor," she said. "Everyone knew Eleanor. I knew why she wanted to go back east." Pearl looked at me steadily. "Not the fever. Before the fever. Why she wanted to leave." "Pearl, I'm not telling you today. You are not ready to hear it today." She picked up her needle. "But you are going to need to hear it before this is over." I left without answering. I thought about it for the rest of the day, and then I put it somewhere I did not have to look at it, which was something I had gotten very good at. 2 weeks after the wedding, Frank brought me the first piece. He sat across from me in the office with the look he wore when delivering bad news, which was the look of a man who had practiced not showing what he felt, and had gotten almost good enough at it. "The debt Harlan Ashford owed Crane," Frank said. "I cannot trace it to any legitimate transaction. It appears in Crane's records fully formed. And Cole, the Hollow Creek gang. I found a connection. One of Crane's ranch hands was seen drinking with 2 of the gang members in a saloon 40 miles east, 3 weeks before the attack on the stagecoach." I sat with that for a moment. "Can you prove the connection?" I asked. "Not yet. Then keep looking, and keep it between us." That night I sat on the porch and looked at the lamp burning in Vivian's window. She was reading, or writing. I could hear the faint scratch of pen on paper. She had come to Dusty Creek looking for a job and a spare room. What she had found was a manufactured crisis, a marriage she had not chosen, and a man with a grudge that had apparently been planned before she ever left Boston. She did not know any of it yet. I told myself I was waiting until I had more proof. That was partly true. The other part was that telling her would make her afraid, and something in me had decided very quietly and without my permission that I did not want her to be afraid. I noticed this preference. I did not examine it. I was getting better at not examining things, which is to say I was getting worse in the way that only looks like better from the inside. By the end of the first month, Vivian had read every legal ordinance in Ruth Calloway's files, every recorded contract, every property transfer going back 15 years. Ruth let her in without comment every morning and locked up behind her every evening. For Ruth, this was the equivalent of throwing a parade. I found out what Vivian was looking for when Pearl mentioned it casually, in the way Pearl mentioned important things, as though they were not important at all. "She found 3 contracts with Crane's name," Pearl said, not looking up from her sewing. 2 families who left town within a month of signing. 1 property that appears in the records twice with different figures. I sat down. Why did she not tell me? Pearl looked at me over her needle. Why did you not tell her about Frank's investigation? Silence. Pearl went back to her sewing. You two are the same kind of person, she said. You both collect information and hold it until you are certain. The problem is, certainty takes time, and time is what you do not have. I went home that evening and asked Vivian directly, what did you find in Crane's contracts? She looked at me for a moment, assessing. Then she told me. Detailed, precise, in the correct legal terminology. 3 contracts, 2 families gone. Figures that did not match. She had reconstructed everything from memory after the files were accessed. She had a remarkable memory. I was beginning to understand that remarkable was the word that applied to most of what she did. The next Saturday, we went to the market together for the first time, maintaining the appearance of an ordinary married couple. I watched her move through the stalls. She spoke to everyone with the same attention. The hardware man, the egg seller, 2 children who decided she was interesting and followed her for half an hour. She stopped at a stall selling ink and small goods. She picked up a jar of indigo ink and held it for a moment longer than necessary. A small hesitation. Something private moving across her face before she set it back down. She had no one to write to. I understood this suddenly and completely. In Boston, she would have written letters. Here, there was no one yet. That afternoon, I arranged for a writing desk to be delivered from the furniture maker on the east end of the street. I had it placed in her room while she was at Pearl's. She came home and stood in her doorway looking at it. She did not thank me that evening. The next morning, the ink jar was on the desk, and she had clearly been writing for some time. When she looked at me over breakfast, something was in it that I did not have a name for yet, but I stored it carefully. On that same morning, a letter arrived from Thomas Aldridge, Eleanor's brother in Kansas. A position available. Better land, easier winters, a real future. It is time to stop punishing yourself, Cole, Thomas wrote. Eleanor would not want this. I put the letter in the desk drawer face down. Vivian saw the envelope, not the contents. Just the postmark and the way my jaw tightened when I read it. She said nothing. But that evening she was quieter than usual, and I noticed but did not ask. I should have asked. This was my first real mistake. 2 weeks later, Serena made her first calculated move. She came to Pearl's shop while I was elsewhere and spoke with Vivian over tea. She spoke of Eleanor with careful reverence. The most patient woman I have ever known, Serena said. Serena. Cole needed that. He is not an easy man, and Eleanor had a gift for making difficult men feel at peace. The implication was precise. You are not Eleanor. You are not what he needs. Vivian walked home in the afternoon heat and said nothing, but I could see the letter from Kansas in her eyes when she looked at me that evening. She was calculating whether she was something I was enduring rather than choosing. I did not ask. I told myself she was fine. I was lying to myself. That same night, something happened that I would only understand much later. A summer storm came in fast, the way Arizona storms did, flooding the street in 20 minutes. The roof leaked in 2 places. Vivian was up at 2 in the morning with pots and the calm efficiency of someone who had dealt with worse. I heard her moving and came out without thinking. Without discussion, I found 2 more containers and took up a position on the other side of the room. We sat on the floor listening to rain. She spoke without looking at me. My mother died when I was 12. After that, my father worked constantly. I think he did not know what to do with a daughter who reminded him of her. I raised myself, mostly. I said, Pearl said you walk like someone who learned to take up exactly the right amount of space. She looked at me then. She said, Pearl also told me that after Eleanor's funeral you came home and moved every piece of furniture in this house to a different place. I was quiet. Why? She asked. Long pause. Because every piece was in the place Eleanor had put it, and I could not. It seemed easier to move the furniture. She looked at me for a long moment, did not offer comfort, did not deflect, just looked. And I felt strangely that being seen clearly by someone was not the same as being exposed. I was beginning to understand the difference. On a Thursday in August, someone broke into Pearl's shop overnight. Nothing was taken. Bolts of fabric were slashed. The account books Vivian had been keeping were torn apart and scattered across the floor. The legal notes she had made about Crane's contracts were gone entirely. I stood in the wreckage with Frank before the town woke up. "He is sending 2 messages," I said. "One to Pearl, one to Vivian." Frank said, "The records she was keeping. She found something in Crane's contracts, and someone knew it." I put my hat back on. I should have told her sooner. I went to Pearl's to find Vivian. She was already there, standing in the middle of the destroyed shop with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not fear. Something colder than fear. Anger that had nowhere yet to go. Before I could say anything, Pearl told me quietly that Vivian had left for about 2 hours the previous afternoon. Alone. She had not said where. I knew where. I found her at home that evening and asked directly. She told me. She had gone to Crane's bank, offered to sign away any claim to her father's estate if he would leave Pearl and the town alone. "What did he say?" I asked. "He said it was never about the estate." The room was very quiet. "How long?" she said. I looked at her. "How long have you known he was behind the attack on the stagecoach, Cole?" "3 weeks," I said. She stood up, crossed to the window. I watched her shoulders and understood she was deciding something important. "You kept that from me." "I did not have proof yet. That is not why." She turned. "You decided I did not need to know. You decided that for me." "Yes," I said, "because that was true, and I was not going to lie about it. Do not do it again." "Vivian." I said, "Do not do it again." I sat down at the table. I said, "Everything I know, from the beginning. And then you tell me everything you know. No more decisions made without the other person." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she sat down. We talked for 2 hours. I told her everything Frank had found. She told me about the contracts, the families, the figures that appeared twice. We built it together, piece by piece, spread across the kitchen table. At the end of it, I said, "You have a remarkable memory." She said, "There is one more thing." She went to her room and came back with a sealed envelope. She had sewn it into the lining of her trunk. I could see the stitching that had held it. Her father had sent it to her through his attorney in Boston with one instruction: "Open it only when you are safe and away from Boston." "I have been carrying it since I left," she said. "Open it," I said. Inside was not a complete document. It was pieces, correspondence, dates and figures, and a note in Harlan Ashford's handwriting. "Douglas Crane manufactured this debt. He threatened Vivian if I went to the law. Get this to someone who can use it. I'm sorry I could not be braver." Vivian read it twice. "Set it down. He knew," she said. "He knew, and he left you the best thing he could. Evidence, a weapon." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why did he not use it himself?" "Because Crane threatened you. Your father chose to protect you over protecting himself." She absorbed this. I watched something shift in her face. Not resolution exactly, more like the rearranging of a long-held grief into a different shape. "This is not enough to convict him," I said, "but it is enough to open a federal investigation. I need to send this to Phoenix without Crane knowing." "How long will that take?" "Weeks, maybe longer. And in the meantime," I looked at the documents, then at her. "In the meantime, we are very careful and we trust each other and we do not go into any buildings alone." She looked at me steadily. "That is a significant adjustment to my independence, I know. I will allow it. Temporarily." "Noted," I said. "Go to sleep, Vivian." She almost smiled. It was the 3rd time I had seen her almost smile, and I had begun to notice that I was counting. There is a particular kind of man who can be in a room with something important for weeks and choose not to see it. I am that kind of man. I developed the skill as a survival mechanism after Eleanor died and had been using it so long it had become unconscious. What I had not accounted for was meeting a woman who made the unconscious impossible. By September, things between Vivian and me had shifted in ways I could observe but not yet name. I noticed what time she came home from Pearl's. I noticed when she skipped lunch because she was absorbed in something she was reading. I noticed the way she held her coffee cup with both hands in the morning, the way she tilted her head slightly when she was thinking through a problem. I told myself I was observant by profession. That was true, and it was not the whole truth. The shooting lessons began in late August, not for romantic reasons. Because Frank had confirmed that one of Crane's ranch hands had been identified as the man who planned the stagecoach route with the Hollow Creek gang, and I understood that Crane was not finished. I took her to the field behind the church where I did my own practice. The first 5 shots went wide. She was fighting the recoil instead of anticipating it, gripping too hard, tensing at the moment she needed to be still. I stepped in behind her. I adjusted her grip, her stance, talked her through it with my voice close and quiet, both of us aware of the contact, neither of us acknowledging it. 6th shot, center of the target. She turned around. The smile that followed was not the one she used socially. I had catalogued that one. This was different, unguarded, slightly surprised at herself. I will not pretend I did not notice what that smile did to my chest. I noticed. I filed it in the same place I filed all the things I was not yet ready to examine. Then Serena made her second move. She came to Pearl's shop one afternoon while I was at the office. She brought a letter. She told Vivian she had found it among some things of mine she had been storing. A letter Eleanor had written but never sent. The letter described loneliness, a husband who loved his work more than his home, a desire to leave. Vivian came home that evening quieter than I had ever seen her. I asked what happened. She told me. I went to the cabinet. I took out the wooden box with Eleanor's name on it that I had not opened in 3 years. I brought it to the table and opened it. These are Eleanor's letters, I said. Everyone she wrote to me, and everyone I wrote to her that she kept. You can read all of them if you want. There is no letter like what Serena described. Vivian looked at the box. She did not touch it. I do not need to read them, she said. Why not? Because you just showed them to me. I did not immediately understand what she meant. Later I would. That week Pearl finally told me what she had been holding back. She sat me down in the back of the shop and told me that Eleanor had come to see her 6 months before the fever. She was not unhappy. She was not planning to leave. She wanted to talk to someone who would not worry. She said she understood why you stayed, Pearl told me. She said the town needed you, and she knew that when she married you. She was not angry. She was proud of you. Pearl looked at me steadily. I should have told you years ago. I did not because you sealed yourself up and I could not find the seam. I sat there for a moment. Why now, I asked. Because there is a woman in this town who is trying to decide if you are worth the risk. Pearl picked up her needle. You are. But you need to stop being dead first. I walked home in the early dark. The lamp was on in Vivian's room. I could hear the scratch of her pen on the writing desk. I stood on my own porch and thought about what Pearl had said, about what it would cost to stop being dead, about whether I had the courage for it after 3 years of the alternative. The pen kept scratching. She was writing something. I found, to my considerable alarm, that I wanted to know what. In late September, Crane called a town council meeting. His motion: suspend Sheriff Cole Ryder pending an investigation into the fraudulent use of a marriage to circumvent a legal contract. The church was full. The whole town came. Frank sat in the front row with his arms crossed. Pearl sat behind him. Ruth Calloway sat in the gallery with the expression of a woman who had come to render judgment and had already begun. Crane's lawyer was from Tucson. Expensive suit. Polished argument. He dismantled my character point by point, calmly, thoroughly, with the confidence of a man who had done this before in other towns. I stood at the front and took it. I answered questions plainly. But the legal argument was going against me, and I could feel it. Then Vivian stood up in the gallery. The room went quiet. This was not done. She addressed the council anyway. She cited the relevant statutes by number. She dismantled the fraudulent marriage argument using the specific language of the contract itself, pointing out 3 clauses Crane's lawyer had misrepresented. Then she turned to face the room, not the council, the whole room, and she spoke about what she had found in the historical records. 2 families, 3 properties. Numbers that appeared twice with different figures. She did not accuse. She asked questions. Precise, unanswerable questions. Harold Marsh, the feed store owner who had been the undecided vote, was watching her with the expression of a man who had made up his mind. The vote was 4-2. I kept my badge. Crane passed me on the church steps afterward, quietly, without drama. Your wife is remarkable, Sheriff. I understand now why my original assessment of her potential was correct. Stay away from her, I said, or what? He adjusted his hat. You will arrest me for being impressed. He walked away. That evening we sat on the porch together in the cooling dark, both of us still carrying the residue of the day. You did not have to do that, I said. Yes, I did. It made you more visible to him. I was already visible to him. She looked at the dark horizon. At least now the town knows what is in those contracts. Long silence. Vivian, I said. She looked at me. I do not want you hurt. A pause. The pause of a man choosing between the careful version and the true version. I do not want you hurt because this town would be less without you. Because Pearl would be less. Because I have apparently become a man who counts the hours until someone comes home. I did not plan for that. She was quiet for a moment. Neither did I, she said. We sat with that. Neither of us moved. Neither of us needed to yet. But something had been said that could not be unsaid, and we both knew it. Then Frank came to find me at midnight. He sat down across from me in the office with the look he wore when the news was very bad. Serena Voss has been seen at Crane's house, he said, twice this week. I followed her the second time. She was there 40 minutes. I said, what did she tell him? Best I can figure? The envelope. That Vivian has documents from her father, that there is evidence against Crane inside. A long silence. Cole. She was not doing it for money. I do not think she is being paid. What then? Frank, uncomfortably. I think she thought if Crane had the documents, he would take Vivian with them. And then things would go back to how they were. Back, I said. Yeah, there is no back. There has not been a back for a long time. Move the documents tonight. Tell only Vivienne where they are. Do not tell me. And Serena? I thought about this. Leave her. She made her choice out of grief, not malice. I will not punish that unless she does it again. I knocked on Vivian's door. She opened it immediately. She had not been asleep. I told her about Serena. All of it. When I finished, she was quiet. Then she said, You are not angry at her. I understand her. That is more than she deserves. Maybe. But I have been a person who acted out of grief and made choices I could not take back. I am not in a position to throw stones. She looked at me with something I could not fully read. The documents are already moved, she said. I moved them 3 days ago. I stared at her. 3 days ago. When I realized Serena had been in the house while we were both at the council preparation meeting. She has a key she should not have. I did not know what she was planning, but I did not want to find out the hard way. You did not tell me. You had enough. Vivian, I know. She met my eyes. It will not happen again. I almost smiled. Good night, Vivian. Good night, Cole. I went to Serena's house the next morning before the town woke up. She opened the door and knew immediately what this was. I thought if he had what he wanted, she said, the evidence, he would let the girl go. Then everything could. Go back, I said. Yes, Serena, there is nothing to go back to. There was not before Vivian arrived. That is not her fault. That is not your fault. That is just true. She looked at me. You love her. I did not answer. I asked her not to contact Crane again. She agreed. I left. She watched me from the doorway. It was the last scene she had in this story. She was not villainous at her exit, just diminished and sad, and finally seeing something clearly that she had been refusing to see. 3 weeks later, Crane acted on what Serena had told him. 3 men came to the house at 10 at night. Professional, not local. I was at the office. Vivian heard them before they reached the door. In months of frontier living, she had become someone who knew the difference between silence and the sound of men trying to be quiet, which is not the same thing. She did not run. She took the revolver I had taught her to use. She put her back to the corner that covered both the front door and the window, and she waited. The door came in on the second kick. She fired once, hit the first man in the shoulder. The second man got her wrist. She lost the gun. The third man had her from behind. I heard the shot from 2 streets away. A single gunshot in a quiet town at night is not ambiguous. I ran. Cole Ryder, who does not run, who moves with the deliberate efficiency of a man who learned that running costs you the breath you need for what comes next. I ran because I was afraid in a way I had not been since Eleanor, and I did not stop to examine what that meant. I came through the door and took the scene in 1 second, Vivian in the grip of a man with a knife at her throat. 2 others between us. "Let her go," I said. "Drop it or she is done," the man said. I did not drop it. I did not negotiate. I had done this long enough to know that negotiation from this position only works if the other person has something to lose. Then Vivian dropped her weight. Without warning, without any signal to me, she simply went limp. Dead weight. The grip loosened for a fraction of a second. I fired twice, then it was over. I was on my knees in front of her before the echo finished. My hands on her face, checking the cut on her temple, the bruising at her throat. My hands were shaking. She saw them. "You are shaking," she said. "I know. Cole. I know." I pulled her in. Not romantic. Human. The gesture of someone who needed to verify with their whole body that another person was still in the world. She let me. We stayed like that for a moment that was longer than it was. Then she said, "I dropped my weight. I saw. Did it help? You gave me the opening I needed. Good." She was quiet. I was terrified. "So was I said. "That is allowed." Pearl arrived within minutes. Frank handled the official business. Ruth Calloway came with towels and the expression of a woman who had come to be useful. They cleaned the scene with grim efficiency. At some point, Pearl sat beside Vivian on the porch steps and said quietly, "He ran to you. I saw him from my window." "I know," Vivian said. "He did not run when Eleanor was sick. He has never run for anything before." "I know," Vivian said again. The next morning, I sent the full report to the federal marshal's office in Phoenix. Frank's investigation, the envelope documents, the connection to the Hollow Creek gang, the attack on the house. Everything we had. It was not enough to convict Crane, but it was enough to open a federal investigation, which meant he could no longer make this disappear with local money and local judges. "Cole," Vivian said that evening. She was sitting at the table with her coffee, watching me. "You need to sleep, I know. Then go to sleep, in a minute." She looked at me. She said, "Thank you for running." I did not have an answer for that. I went to bed. In the morning there was coffee already made when I came out, and she was at the writing desk, and the house was full of ordinary sounds. I stood in the kitchen doorway and thought, this is what I missed, not the absence of grief, just this. The morning of the 6-month anniversary of our wedding, I placed a sealed envelope on the breakfast table before Vivian came out. Inside was travel money, enough for anywhere she wanted to go. I had also written out a formal release from the marriage contract, drafted by myself, witnessed by Frank, legally complete. She came to the table and looked at the envelope for a long moment. She did not touch it. "You remembered the date," she said. "I have been aware of the date for approximately 3 weeks," I said. "And this is you keeping your promise." "Yes." She poured her coffee. Sat. Then she looked at me directly. "What do you want, Cole? What I want is not. Dawn, not. She did not raise her voice. Just looked at me steadily. I asked you plainly. Answer plainly. I met her eyes. I want you to stay. Not because of Crane. Not because of the town. Because this house has been alive since you came into it. And I did not know how dead it was before. She opened her mouth to answer. Frank came through the door without knocking. He sat down at the table with the look that meant the news was bad and urgent. The original marriage contract, he said. Paragraph 9, I found a clause we missed. He put the document on the table between us. The clause was specific. If the contracted party entered into another marriage, that marriage had to be proven legitimate within 6 months of the contract's origination date. Not the wedding date, the origination date. The contract was originated 11 months ago. The 6-month proof window had expired 5 days ago. Crane had filed with the territorial court in Tucson a motion to void our marriage on grounds that no proof of legitimacy had been presented within the contractual window. The hearing was in 3 days. He planned this from the beginning, Vivian said. She was reading the clause carefully. He knew a man trying to protect someone would focus on keeping her safe, not reading every word of the original document. We missed it, I said. We missed it. She looked up. What does proof of legitimacy require? Frank said, evidence that the marriage is a functioning partnership. Shared residence, shared finances, shared life. We have that, Vivian said. We have to present it at a hearing in front of a judge. Crane requested, I said. Then we go to the hearing, Vivian said. That afternoon, Crane came to the office alone. He sat across from me with the expression of a man who had been playing a longer game than I had understood. I will withdraw the motion, he said, if Vivian agrees to leave Dusty Creek voluntarily within the week. She keeps the travel money, no further interference from me. Why? I asked. The federal investigation is inconvenient. A trial would be expensive. He looked at me steadily. And you have made this considerably more difficult than I anticipated. I prefer to cut my losses. The answer is no. You have not asked her. I do not need to, you are certain. She will tell you herself tomorrow, I said. That evening I told Vivian about the offer. He is giving me a way out, she said. Yes. And you told him no without asking me. I told him I did not need to ask you. There is a difference. She looked at me. Explain the difference. I told him no because I know what you will say, not because your answer does not matter. Because I have been paying attention for 6 months and I know who you are. A long silence. What if you are wrong? Am I? She looked at the table. No. She was quiet a moment. But Cole. Tomorrow at the hearing, I am going to have to say true things about us, about what this has been. About what? In front of a room full of people. I know. Are you prepared for that? I am prepared for whatever lets you choose to stay, freely, with full information. She looked at me for a long moment. After tomorrow, she said, I want to finish the conversation we were having this morning, before Frank came in. So do I. The hearing was held in the territorial courthouse on a Friday morning in November. The judge was a man from Tucson, formal and skeptical, with the expression of someone who had seen too many frontier arrangements presented as legitimate marriages. Crane's lawyer was the same one from the council meeting. He was good. He knew it. Frank testified first. The facts of the timeline. Precise, clinical, unimpeachable. The attack, the rescue, the contract, the wedding. He gave no opinions. He did not need to. Pearl testified next. She described what she had observed in 6 months, the writing desk I had delivered without explanation, the burned biscuits I ate without complaint, the running. She did not editorialize, she described. The room drew its own conclusions. Ruth Calloway testified last before Vivian. Character, community, the 40 children in this town who now had access to legal documents and someone to explain what was in them, because of the work Vivian had done quietly and without announcement for 5 months. Then Vivian took the stand. Crane's lawyer asked the direct question. Mrs. Ryder, was this marriage arranged specifically to circumvent the contractual obligation to Mr. Crane? Vivian said, It began that way. Yes. Murmurs. Crane allowed himself a small smile. And when, the lawyer asked, did it stop beginning that way? Crane's lawyer began to object. The judge raised a hand. I will allow it. Answer the question. Vivian was quiet for a moment, then she spoke. There was a night in August, a rainstorm. The roof of the house leaked in 2 places, and I was up at 2 in the morning managing it alone. He appeared, not because I asked, not because it was his job, but because a sound in the house woke him, and he came to see if I was all right. We sat on the floor for 2 hours. He told me about a woman named Margaret Pruitt, a widow with 2 children, who he could not protect, and why he could not leave Dusty Creek until he was certain no one else would go the same way. She paused. He told me because I asked. And he is not a man who tells things easily. I know that because I've been paying attention for 6 months. The room was very quiet. That is when it stopped beginning that way, she said. That night, on the kitchen floor, with the rain coming in. The back door of the courthouse opened. 2 men entered, federal marshal badges, Tucson office. The lead marshal addressed the judge. Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption. We have a federal warrant for the arrest of Douglas Crane on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to assault. Crane stood. He was composed, but the composure was visible as effort in a way it had not been before. He looked at me, then at Vivian. He reached into his jacket. The room tensed. He placed a folded document on the table in front of his lawyer. Before you take me anywhere, Marshal, he said, I am withdrawing the motion before this court. The marriage stands. I said, why? He looked at Vivian one last time. Because I was wrong about what I wanted. What I wanted was that. He nodded toward her. What I actually needed was someone capable of stopping me. I found one. Too late, and in the wrong person. But there it is. He walked out with the marshals. The room exhaled. Outside the courthouse, the town spilled into the afternoon sun. People were talking, calling to each other, the particular noise of a community that has witnessed something and is not yet sure what to make of it. Vivian and I stood in the middle of the street with people moving around us. The hearing is over, I said. Yes. The contract is void. Yes, the federal case will take months. You will likely be called as a witness, which means you will need to be available. In the territory. She looked at me. Cole Ryder, Vivian. Are you making a legal argument for why I have to stay? A pause. The closest thing to a smile I had managed in 6 months. I am making every argument I can find. She looked at me for a long moment. This morning, she said, you were going to say something before Frank came in. Yes, say it now. I looked at her. This woman who had swung a broken umbrella at me in a canyon, who had negotiated her own wedding contract, who had memorized the contents of fraudulent documents and stood up in a church full of people and told them exactly what she had found, who had dropped her own weight in a room full of men to give me the opening I needed, who had moved the documents 3 days before I told her to because she had already understood the danger. I love you, I said. I did not plan to. I planned against it actively for approximately 5 months. It happened anyway. You are the most stubborn, most precise, most remarkable person who has ever walked into this town, and I would like, if you are willing, to stop calling what we have a transaction. What would you call it instead, she asked. A life, if you will have one with me. She stepped forward. She took my face in both hands. This woman who touched things carefully and deliberately, and only when she meant it. I will have one with you, she said. I have been having one with you since August. I was just waiting for you to catch up. She kissed me, right there in the main street of Dusty Creek with the whole town watching and the November sun cutting low across the red dust. I did not care who was watching. People ask me when I knew. I tell Frank it was the umbrella, because Frank appreciates a story with a weapon in it. I tell Pearl it was the rain. because Pearl already knows and likes to hear me say it. I tell Ruth it was the courthouse, because Ruth believes in evidence, and that day we had plenty. The truth is, I knew on the second morning. I woke up and the house had sounds in it that were not mine. Instead of the silence I had lived in for 3 years, there was life. Ordinary, inconvenient, remarkable life. A woman in my kitchen refusing to apologize for burned biscuits. A pair of boots by the door that were not my boots. Ink on a writing desk I had no business buying, I knew on the second morning. I was afraid for approximately 4 months after that. Then she stood up in a church full of people who doubted her and cited frontier statutes from memory. And I thought, there is no version of this story where I am afraid of that woman. There is only the version where I am grateful. The federal case against Douglas Crane concluded 8 months after his arrest. He was convicted on all major counts and sentenced in Tucson. The 2 families who had been pushed off their land received settlements from the liquidation of his estate. The Hollow Creek gang members involved in the stagecoach attack were tried separately. I testified at both proceedings. So did Vivian. Dusty Creek has a school now. Vivian built it. She raised the money, hired 2 teachers, ordered books from 3 cities. She also runs what she calls a consultation office out of Pearl's back room. It is technically a legal practice performed by a woman without a formal degree, which is technically my jurisdiction to address. I have technically declined to address it. Frank calls it the most effective use of willful blindness he has ever observed in a lawman. We have a daughter, Clara Eleanor. She has her mother's eyes and her mother's absolute refusal to be told what to do, which I find both exhausting and the best thing I have ever seen. Last spring, Vivian found the envelope I had been keeping since October. I had written in it, alone at 2 in the morning, every reason I had already fallen in love with her, and every reason I was too much of a coward to say so. I had not planned for her to find it. She read it, set it down, looked at me. October, she said. You wrote this in October? Yes. Cole. It was October when I knew. We looked at each other. 2 people who had been keeping the same secret from the same person for the same amount of time. She laughed first. I followed. It was the best sound this house has ever held. The contract that brought us here is filed somewhere in the Tucson federal records, voided and irrelevant. My mother's ring still sits on her finger, still slightly too large, still turned inward toward her palm the way she has always worn it. I asked her once why she never had it resized. Because it fits the way things that matter fit, she said. A little loose, a little uncertain, but on, and staying on. I did not have an answer for that. I rarely do with her. That is, without question, the best thing that has ever happened to me. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.
As a writer who has spent years telling stories of the American West, I see this story not simply as a tale of danger, law, and survival, but as a deeply human narrative about redemption, trust, and the courage to live again. At its heart, the story explores the idea that people often carry invisible wounds, grief, regret, and guilt that shape their choices long after the original pain has passed. Cole Ryder, a sheriff hardened by loss, represents a man who has chosen emotional isolation as a form of survival. After losing his wife, he convinces himself that duty and distance are safer than connection. Yet, through Vivian's arrival, his carefully controlled world is disrupted. The meaning of the story lies in this transformation. Healing does not come from avoidance, but from the willingness to risk feeling again. Vivian, on the other hand, embodies resilience and independence. She is not portrayed as someone waiting to be saved, but as a woman who actively shapes her own fate. Even when placed in a vulnerable situation, bound by a contract she did not choose, she negotiates, observes, learns, and ultimately becomes a force of justice. The story highlights that true strength is not loud or aggressive. It is quiet, steady, and rooted in self-respect. Her character teaches us that dignity and agency must be protected, even in the harshest circumstances. A central moral lesson of the story is the importance of honesty in relationships. Both Cole and Vivian begin their marriage as a transaction, built on necessity rather than emotion. However, their relationship evolves because they choose honesty over comfort. They admit their fears, their past mistakes, and their intentions. This openness allows trust to grow. The story suggests that real connection cannot exist without truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable. Another significant lesson is about responsibility and courage. Cole's past failure, his inability to protect others from injustice, haunts him. His decision to help Vivian is partly an attempt to correct that failure. Yet the story makes it clear that redemption is not achieved through intention alone, but through consistent action. Cole learns that doing the right thing often requires standing alone, making difficult decisions, and accepting the consequences. In the end, justice is not immediate, but perseverance leads to it. The story also addresses the danger of power. Used without morality, Douglas Crane represents corruption hidden behind legality. His actions remind us that what is legal is not always right. The narrative encourages readers to question systems that allow injustice to exist and emphasizes the role of individuals in challenging such systems. Vivian's careful study of the law and her use of knowledge as a weapon reinforce the idea that education and awareness are powerful tools against oppression. Finally, the story carries a quiet but profound message about love. Love here is not sudden or idealized. It grows slowly through shared struggles, mutual respect, and small everyday moments. It is found in burned biscuits, in silent support during storms, and in the courage to stand beside someone in danger. This kind of love is not about possession, but about choice. The choice to stay, to trust, and to build a life together. In conclusion, the story teaches us that healing is possible, but it requires courage. That justice demands persistence. And that love, when built on honesty and respect, can transform even the most broken lives. It reminds us that no matter how harsh the world may be, there is always room for change, for connection, and for hope.